Hello and welcome to Crisis and Communication from an organisational perspective. This is the first of two talks which address crisis communication from an organisational perspective. So the first one at the moment is looking at incident response. Next time we'll be focusing more on the media side. But at the moment, we're going to focus on the incident response from an organisational perspective. So what does that mean? Well, it means that what does the organisation itself have to think about when it comes to responding and communicating during a crisis? And what does it mean for leaders in the organisation? Now, when we're talking about organisation, remember, this is a Masters of Public Administration that you're doing. So, or it's a policy focused program. So really what we're doing is focusing on governmental perspectives mainly, although there's some natural crossover with organisational studies because a government organisation or a private organisation often have to follow similar rules and guiding frameworks. However, when I talk generally, I'm referring to governmental organisations. And this talk today builds on the material you had last week when we talked about the conceptual lenses for understanding crisis management. We looked at all the different perspectives around what crisis means and some of the kind of political science perspectives around how crisis relates to our study of the social sciences. Now we're getting to the stage where we're kind of becoming more focused in terms of thinking about the response and planning around crisis management itself. Okay, I'll just move on to the next slide. So, when we're talking about planning for crises, it's a very important aspect of the crisis management process. McConnell and Drennan note that the key task for policymakers and crisis managers is to institutionalize procedures and create cultural climates which develop capacities to cope with whatever extraordinary threats come their way. What does that mean? Well, let's think about this in terms of the institutionalization of procedures and cultural climates. It really means that crisis planning is seen as routine and normalized within an organization. A challenge if a crisis emerges is if you've not got the capacities or the culture to allow you to respond quickly, then your response will be deficient. So what McConnell and Drennan are saying here is that crisis preparedness and crisis planning should be a routine part of an organisation's business. It should be a key part of what government thinks about and how it approaches organisational activity. If they don't, and it's not part of the cultural activity of an organisation, then the argument could be that the crisis management response will be heavily deficient. So it's important to always think about that. If you go into government or you're working in government, the fact that crisis preparedness is a key part of what your organisation should be doing. When we think about crisis preparedness, there's a number of dimensions which we should think about very carefully and reflect on. Crisis preparedness activities should always be high on institutional and policy agendas. But in the world of politics, we often find that crisis prevention and preparedness isn't always prioritised. Why is that the case? Well, preparing for something that might not actually happen doesn't really draw much media attention. It doesn't draw much attention in terms of giving you political credit because they could be non-events. You could be preparing for something that never actually unfolds. In some ways, perhaps that's why we're seeing a lot of reluctance by governments across the world to invest in addressing long-term issues like climate change, although one hopes that COP26 will lead to some reform in that space. But generally, if you're dealing with long-term risks and threats that could actually be far into the distance. It could be long after you're retired as a policymaker. It could be long after your government has left office. What's the incentive politically for you to invest in crisis preparedness? In some ways, that's quite a cynical view, but it does happen. So preparing for crisis isn't necessarily something that's apolitical. It requires resources. It requires attention. If governments have lots of issues to manage on a day-to-day basis that are far more immediate than a long-term crisis that could happen in, say, 10, 20 years, then it might be that policymakers have a task in their hands in terms of ensuring that crisis preparedness is high on the agenda. That said, if a crisis does emerge, and if you're in government or if you're, say, a civil servant working within a government department and it kind of catches you off guard because you're not prepared for a crisis, then it might be that your reputation, and we'll come back to this later as well, this idea of reputation, your reputation could be left in tatters. It could be that societal actors think that you don't care about pre-crisis planning arrangements. Does that affect the legitimacy of the the kind of the capacity or the, if you like, the effectiveness of your leadership? But crisis planning is about forward thinking. It's about preparedness for all eventualities. Policymakers will want to know, will want to show that they are prepared for any crisis and that they'll take the appropriate measures to ensure public safety. But we do know that political leaders often have other concerns. They have lots of other things to address and deal with. In the UK, for instance, for many years, we've had terrible flooding crises. And often, the response by the media and opposition political parties is, well, you knew this was going to happen. You knew that these issues were a problem, but you failed to invest in flood prevention measures. Often, if crises happen in quick succession like that, so crises become routinized, that draws more pressure on government to show their learning lessons and preparing for the next crisis. But it doesn't always happen, because crisis preparedness takes money, it takes resources, and it takes capacity. And like I said before, if, for instance, a government is working to short parliamentary terms, in the UK, for instance, we have 5-year parliamentary terms, whereby there'll be an election after 5 years, and it could be that there's a change of government after 5 years. It doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes the government of the day is re-elected, but it could be that you're not re-elected in 5 years. Therefore, what's your political incentive to invest in crisis preparedness? Well, it comes down to leadership. It comes down to sound leadership and embedding crisis preparedness into the cultures and routines of the institutions of government. So contingency planning, it's about a strategy to institutionalize procedures and develop crisis preparedness. And public authorities can seek to quell uncertainty by simply showing they have a plan. Having a plan's one thing, but what if that plan is overly technical? What if that plan has not been updated effectively enough in light of new evidence or changes in governance arrangements? Plans have to be flexible, because if a plan is overly technical, overly detailed, then how can you possibly implement it quickly and also based on a resilience culture? But does that mean we don't need a plan? Of course not. Of course a plan is needed, but policymakers have to ensure that stakeholders know what their roles are under certain scenarios and how they fit into the picture of resolving the crisis and making decisions to help alleviate uncertainty. So plans have to be flexible based on resilience. But the problem is, if a plan is overly technical, that can lead to a degree of information overload. It can lead to a degree of paralysis, institutional paralysis, whereby the stakeholders get too occupied and focus too much on the detail rather than the big picture. So plans have to be there and they have to be tested, but they also have to be flexible. So capacities is very, very important. You have to build in capacity to plan for crisis and test out plans. It's important that flexibility ensures that there's inter-organisational coordination and having the capabilities to adapt in light of new circumstances. Crises can flare up, they can flare down, they have different qualities. No crisis is the same. Therefore, your ability to respond has to be based on your ability to prepare. So what does this really mean then? What things can you do if you're in government? Say, for example, after your degree, you go into a crisis management role in government, or even for an NGO or some other organisation, and you're thinking about contingency planning. What can we learn from the literature around what pre-crisis planning process should include? Well, planning processes should be based on accurate information of threats and the likely human responses. Accurate knowledge means there has to be evidence there, the best available evidence. So institutional knowledge is not something that can just appear. It has to be nurtured. Institutional memories can be lost over time. So one of my areas of research was the major foot and mouth disease crisis in the UK. And in 2001, that's the focus of my research, the 2001 crisis, we never had a massive foot and mouth crisis like we did in 2001 for about 40 years-ish, 35, 40 years. In the mid-60s, there was a major foot and mouth outbreak in the UK, and there was an inquiry, there was lessons to be learned, and that was fine, but time had passed. Institutional memories of those lessons had waned over time. They got lost because people retire, institutions change, the agenda moves on. But how do you maintain that knowledge? How do you nurture that institutional knowledge? Well, it's through contingency planning. It's through ensuring that your contingency plans are living documents. They're alive, they're living, they're tested, they're updated. So that's what we mean by accurate knowledge. Pre-crisis planning should encourage appropriate action by crisis managers. Appropriate action that's measured and considered. You perhaps don't overmanage, because if you overmanage, then that could actually cause other problems in that you might not be dealing with the matter at hand. You might almost be investing too much of your time and energy on something that's more easily resolvable. So appropriate action is needed. But that can also work the other way, whereby contingency planning should encourage crisis managers to do enough. Their level of appropriateness might be to avoid carelessness or perhaps not doing enough to resolve the crisis. So there's a balance there that's required. Like I say, we have to encourage flexibility in response, promote inter-organisational coordination. Oftentimes what that requires is some facilitator which can bring together organisations, because in order to ensure inter-organisational coordination, so we mean inter, which means across different entities, so say 2 or 3 departments or organisations that need to work together, often there has to be a facilitator that brings that together, a higher level organisation or body which can act as an enabler, a partnership manager to draw different actors together. It's not an easy exercise because sometimes you have to know who you need to coordinate with, and that can differ depending on the crisis. And it can also differ depending on the level of governance we're talking about. So does it mean you have to coordinate between a local authority, perhaps a municipality, and national government? It might not be inter-organisational coordination that's perhaps an horizontal relationship. It can be a vertical relationship, depending on where power lies and where the crisis response is best placed to be managed. It's important to integrate plans for each hazard or incident into a multi-hazard approach, because one crisis could spill over into another. If you think about, say, a crisis that can cross borders, The coronavirus is a good example of where national remit, or perhaps kind of national boundaries, are not very helpful, because some crises are transboundary. And what that can mean is you've got multiple stakeholders involved. It might be that, for example, under a terrorist attack, it might not be about national borders. There could be something that happens within a border, could be within a country or a territory. But say a terrorist attack happens, say it's an explosion on the transport system, that could lead to a hazard in terms of the infrastructure of the transport system itself, risk to human life. Could it be that the explosion has caused flooding, burst pipes? Has it led to wider issues in terms of how Home Affairs policy operates? So some hazards can lead to multiple hazards. Therefore, what that really calls for is government to have a cross-sectoral approach, an approach whereby crisis management isn't just seen as a one government department's business. It's seen as a cross-governmental dimension. It's seen as a cross-governmental activity. Training is very important. There's no point in having a crisis management function in an organisation without embedding training to update people on how to improve their practice, test out their practice, because that's all part of the culture of the organisation. Training, development is all part of how you keep yourself fresh for dealing with challenges that come your way. Drills and exercises are very important as part of that process. So crisis simulations, and we'll talk about this further, but crisis simulations are often ways of testing out your plans and keeping your training up to date. As part of that training, you have to adapt, you have to be able to make adjustments, and sometimes that's actually built into pre-crisis exercises, and that whoever's the instructor or the facilitator of the training will throw scenarios in your way to kind of take you off course and perhaps even test your resilience. And it's important to be a strong advocate for the maintenance of resources and a commitment to building capacities for dealing with what we call low probability events. So low probability events could be long-term crises that perhaps might never happen. But being a strong advocate in your organisation to convince those who control resources and senior management that actually contingency planning is an important part of routine business. That's a key aspect of what pre-crisis planning processes should involve as part of the business of government. Coordination in preparedness planning is akin to what Pochonson-Mitroff talked about as a multi-layered or onion-like approach to an organisation, whereby planning involves multiple dimensions. In an onion, what you have is kind of multiple levels in an onion. If you kind of cut an onion, you can see the different levels within one and the different parts of it. Really what we're talking about with crisis management is that kind of analogy, whereby the different levels can include things like human actors, so those that are trained, those that are good personnel for being crisis managers. Could be technology. Technology can be an important way of how you respond. Structures and the cultures. These are joined up things, or these are things that should be joined up within an organisation or across organisations in order to ensure that crises are prepared for and responded to effectively. Again, this issue of cultures comes up, and one of the things I'd like you to think about when it comes to your assignment is, to what extent does your assignment or the organisation that you choose to look at in your assignment, to what extent is there a culture of crisis management, a culture of preparedness? It's a key important part. So culture is of key importance to what we call the temporal and strategic decision-making of an organisation. Whether an organisation is crisis-prone or crisis-prepared is highly dependent on certain organisational factors. These factors are whether an organisation can serve to precipitate a crisis by providing the environment within which such an event can be resolved, or whether a prevailing culture of stagnation and low preparedness constrains the organisational ability to manage threats. Therefore, Crisis experiences in the real world of contingency planning vary. These range from policy tools associated with contingency planning and can involve formal laws and informal conventions. And let's say a little bit more about that. McConnell and Drennan talk about laws to conventions, the different things that can be thought about as part of crisis preparedness, which can range from hard laws to kind of looser conventions. So what are these things? Well, laws are statute, binding obligations, which encourage organisations to develop contingency plans. If you're a member of the European Union, for instance, obviously the UK has now left the European Union, but if you're living in a country, in an EU country, it would be useful for you to know that the European Union itself, as a lawmaking body, requires through law that member states develop contingency plans, actually develop them and show them to European policymakers for threats such as the BSE, foot and mouth, and avian flu. And that was a response to the foot and mouth crisis that we had in the UK in 2001, and other crises like BSE and the avian flu outbreaks that we've had across Europe in the recent decades. The EU is just an example, but what that shows you is sometimes what policymakers do is implement laws, actual laws, which require contingency plans to be developed. Other approaches might be through policy guidelines. So sometimes you'll have governmental actors promoting non-binding guidelines, but they should be taken very seriously by political authorities. So the WHO, international organisation, the World Health Organization, encourages all countries to have plans to deal with outbreaks of pandemic influenza, for instance. And they did even before the coronavirus, and perhaps the coronavirus and even Ebola that predated that in West Africa, perhaps that demonstrates sometimes the limitations of policy guidelines, because the fact that they're non-binding means there's flexibility for national governments across the world to not actually implement them. But the symbolic nature of the policy guidelines can encourage actors to think carefully about pre-crisis planning. What about codes and protocols? Well, these are slightly different, and what these are usually seen in the form of written documents. Again, non-binding, but encourage through step-by-step guidelines as to the practices that should be followed to prepare for a crisis. So, for example, after the London bombings, the terrorist attack in London in 2005 on the London Underground, a protocol known as access overload control was swiftly put in place, which basically shut down the mobile phone network to give priority for more important calls, such as 999 calls or emergency between emergency workers. So those are kind of codes and almost like activities that can be put in place by organisations. They're not necessarily enshrined in law, but they can be part of the routinization of crisis management. What about conventions? Well, conventions are concerned with what is expected of an organisation and its stakeholders. They're almost the kind of norms. You might have heard of kind of norms on behaviours in organisations, that there's certain codes on, or perhaps behaviours that you're supposed to exhibit and follow. And these might be through habit, custom, or psychological contracts that you would have on a day-to-day basis. So conventions of crisis management might be about how you approach your day-to-day business through convention, which aren't necessarily enshrined in law, but just part of the lifeblood of an organisation. But when it comes to developing crisis plans, it's important to involve stakeholders. It's important that contingency planning isn't just about developing a plan in your own office without input from anybody else. Again, like we said before, knowledge is important, and knowledge is often gained from your networks, from your stakeholders. So always ensure that when you're developing a crisis plan, that you do a stakeholder mapping exercise, trying to understand who are the key stakeholders that know about your area of crisis management, so the topic at hand, and perhaps might be able to help you in the event of a crisis occurring. So it's important for you to think quite carefully about who those stakeholders are, think about who they might be, try and engage with them on an ongoing basis. Otherwise, it could be very difficult for you to implement responses that perhaps are more inclusive and evidence-based. Like we said before, training for crises through simulations and exercises can be very important. The key thing though, is realism. It's very important that crisis preparedness activities are not done in such a way whereby they are not fit for purpose in the event of the real crisis happening. So you may have be aware of something called Operation Cygnus. Operation Cygnus was an exercise that took place a few years ago in the UK to deal with a pandemic, and lo and behold, we had the coronavirus pandemic to deal with. But one of the findings from that exercise, that one of the lessons learned, was there wasn't enough capacities to bring ventilators to deal with patients who have been caught by COVID. And what that meant was that the ultimate crisis response in the future was heavily deficient because hospitals didn't have the resource capacity to give the right equipment to patients that were suffering from the disease. So sometimes what tends to happen is you can have these exercises, there's lessons learned from them in terms of the identification of the lesson. So for example, in this case, the need to procure ventilation equipment. But actually that never led to any change in the run-up to what we actually found was this global pandemic. And when the global pandemic hit, the UK was really struggling to source ventilators for hospitals. So it's important that the exercises themselves are fit for purpose, but that the lessons learned from them are also fit for purpose and that they're acted upon. But what are the types of exercises? Well, you can have tabletop exercises, which are role play scenarios, which might not require too many resources, but they can almost be desktop based, and that they don't necessarily require you to go out in the field or kind of be out and actually in society. You could be in your office based on responding to a scenario in the office that you work, and it could be online, or it can be via your occupational space. There's something called simulations as well. They could be virtual reality simulations, quite similar, and using computer-based technologies. On-site functional exercises, which are more hands-on, on the ground, perhaps outside of the organisation, which involve multiple actors, multiple agencies who test aspects of a plan. So a good example of this might be through things like bioterrorism. There might be different organisations that are involved, the police, the NHS, public health authorities, emergency services, which come together and have to work together, including with people like the military, to test out how they respond and how they test their relationships during the crisis. And the scale of that depends. So you can also have full-scale exercises, which are supposed to be in the event of something quite scalable, significant happening, and it requires the deployment of all major crisis management functions. Yeah, it might be the case that some pre-crisis planning exercises include a mixture of the aforementioned types. So for example, tabletops versus simulations, they can be quite similar as well. It depends on what the organisation seeks to do, but it's just to let you know that there are different types of pre-crisis simulations to think about. However, there are wider challenges, and the organisations may suffer from non-adaptive behaviours, from things like bureaucratic politics, poor information gathering, and cultural inertia. It might be that some organisations, because of not embedded a culture of good practice on crisis preparedness, they become overly bureaucratic, they're very reactionary, and haven't had that maintenance that they require. Groupthink is also a problem, in that sometimes what that means is there's a shared sense of invulnerability. It could be some key individuals within an organisation that perhaps what we call put the blinkers on. They don't actually realise the scale of the problem, and they just, it's almost like having wishful thinking that will just go away. Or it'll be like, this couldn't happen to me. You hear of other organisations and other people having problems, but it won't happen to us. That's that type of mentality. It's the frame of mind whereby you think you're not a candidate for a crisis to happen, therefore that'll have an impact on whether or not you'll actually plan for one. So groupthink is very, very challenging when it comes to crisis management, and it can actually be quite catastrophic. Correspondingly, in crisis situations, the way in which different types of motivational biases, wishful thinking and value conflicts can have an impact is through this idea of motivational bias. You could have denial. We're all human. Humans have failures and failings. Therefore, we cannot always assume that all humans are the best crisis managers, because they might not have the wherewithal, the skills, the personality to actually be able to front up during a crisis. And there's something called human error. We're not always perfect. Therefore, these are major challenges for the crisis management process. Government organisations can also suffer from looking at the past, historical analogies. So it might be that some crisis has happened, say, 5 years ago, and you base your crisis preparedness on that crisis that happened 5 years ago. So you're drawing on a historical experience, but things change, and basing your pre-crisis planning on what happened in the past might not actually put you in a position where your institutions are fit for purpose for dealing with future events. So there needs to be forward thinking. Looking at the past too much can impede forward thinking. History can be useful to learn from, but in basing your entire crisis management process and preparedness on what happened in the past will be very difficult and problematic for the future. So there's key tasks for leaders. If you're a leader within an organisation and you're thinking about effective communication and you're thinking about how to actually do crisis management as a leader, well, one of the things that I would say is effective communication is central to effective incident management. And it's important for politicians and officials to act quickly, despite often existing within an information vacuum. If something happens, it might be that you don't know the full picture, because crises can emerge, new information can come to light, but it might be the case that you don't actually have enough information, because it can take time for information to get to you as a leader. So, but you still have to act, even when there's a lack of information. So that really does require resilience and acute decision making. So some key critical tasks is sense making. What's the crisis about? How will it develop? Decision making. How will we deal with it? There's a need to confront the problem. Meaning making. That's really about trying to make sense of what's going on. Communication is very important here, and as well as providing an authoritative account as to what's going on. There's a need to reduce uncertainty amongst the public and amongst your stakeholders. You want to ensure that as a crisis leader, you're showing that you're in control and that you're making sense of the problem. You can ascribe meaning to what's going on. So for instance, when there's a terrorist attack, it could be that you're trying to understand the meaning behind it. Was it a certain terrorist group that was responsible? You're trying to demonstrate that you can create the meaning, understand the meaning, so that you can communicate effectively. Termination is also an important aspect here, because sometimes it can be difficult to know when a crisis is over. The public often look to politicians, bureaucrats, officials in government at senior levels to give a sense of when it's time to calm down, a sense of when normality can be restored. Knowing when the right time to do so is a key task in crisis management, because you don't want to be too premature in saying a crisis has been terminated. But at the same time, you don't want it to go on too long, because there's lots of other factors at play. You want people to get back to normal. You want them to be able to get back to their everyday lives. Or it might be that you want the economy to bounce back. Markets, for instance, don't like uncertainty, and they often bounce back when they know a crisis is over. Okay, and there's often the need to cope with the politics of post-crisis accountability. So for a policymaker's point of view, they will have to engage with inquiries, investigations, and understanding where and how to do that is important. But actually saying as a policymaker that you believe there needs to be an inquiry, there needs to be investigations. That can also be an act of demonstrating that things are moving on. The fact that you're actually calling for an inquiry indicates that we're moving into the post-crisis recovery phase. And that can be useful in terms of demonstrating symbolically, at least, to the public that things are moving on. And as part of that, a critical task for leaders is to learn. Implement processes whereby you're saying to the public, we're going to learn the lessons and we're going to implement mechanisms in order to do that. That could be through things like inquiry processes and investigations. We do live, though, in a risk society. As Beck says, this idea that globalization means that the interconnection between people, technologies, the economy, means that risks can transcend jurisdictions. If you think about the global financial crisis back in 2008, the mortgage subprime market in America went very, very badly. And what happened was that caused ripple effects to the financial markets across the world and created recessions, multiple recessions in European countries and beyond. So what does that indicate? That means that we've got a system, a society which is interconnected. And that interconnection brings risks. So we live in a risk society whereby systems are interdependent. So does that mean that leadership is mission impossible? That's a question for you to think about. Can you prepare for everything? The interconnection between organisations and interconnection between problems and issues is a challenge for crisis management. There's no doubt about that. So is it a mission impossible? Well, if you implement crisis preparedness, it might minimise the problems as best you possibly can, but you have to recognise that sometimes what you're responsible for can have a connection with what other people are responsible for in government and beyond. So if we listen to this talk now by a leadership expert, Amy Edmondson, she talks to us about, if you're a leader, what advice can you have in leading a crisis? It's useful to you to engage with this. If you're having any problems playing this, there's a link there for you to use, and you'll also get a hard copy version of these recorded slides on the Moodle site. But let's play this video and to demonstrate some of what other people have said about leading during a crisis.
We think of a great leader as the unwavering captain who guides us forward through challenge and complexity. Confident, unwavering leaders, armed with data and past experience, have long been celebrated in business and politics alike. But sometimes, and certainly now, a crisis comes along that is so new and so urgent that it upends everything we thought we knew. One thing we know for sure is that more upheavals are coming. In a completely interconnected world, a single political uprising, a viral video, a distant tsunami, or a tiny virus can send shockwaves around the world. Upheaval creates fear, and in the midst of it, people crave security, which can incline leaders toward the usual tropes of strength, confidence, constancy. But it won't work. We have to flip the leadership playbook. First, this type of leadership requires communicating with transparency, communicating often. So how can leaders lead when there is so little certainty, so little clarity? Whether you are a CEO, a prime minister, a middle manager, or even a head of school, upheaval means you have to ramp up the humility. When what you know is limited, pretending that you have the answers isn't helpful. Amidst upheaval, leaders must share what they know and admit what they don't know. Paradoxically, that honesty creates more psychological safety for people, not less. For example, when the pandemic devastated the airline industry virtually overnight, CEO of Delta Airlines, Ed Bastian, ramped up employee communication, despite having so little clarity about the path ahead, facing truly dire results. At one point in 2020, losing over $100 million a day, it would have been far easier for Bastian to wait for more information before taking action. But effective leaders during upheaval don't hide in the shadows. In fact, as Bastian put it, it is far more important to communicate when you don't have the answers than when you do. Second, act with urgency despite incomplete information. Admitting you don't have the answers does not mean avoiding action. While it's natural to want more information, fast action is often the only way to get more information. Worse, inaction leaves people feeling lost and unstable. When New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern laid out a 4-level alert system very early in the COVID-19 crisis, she lacked information with which to set the level. Despite lacking answers, she did not wait to communicate about the threat with the nation. At first, she set the level at 2, only to change it to 4 2 days later as cases rose. That triggered a national lockdown, which no doubt saved countless lives. Later, when cases began to dissipate, she made subsequent decisions reflecting that new information. Third, leaders must hold purpose and values steady, even as goals and situations change. Values can be your guiding light when everything else is up in the air. If you care about customer experience, don't let go of that in times of upheaval. If a core value is health and safety, put that at the center of every decision you make. Now, doing this requires being very transparent about what your values are. And in this way, your steadfastness shows not in your plans, but in your values. Prime Minister Ardern's clear purpose all along was protecting human life, even as the immediate goal shifted from preventing illness to preparing health systems and ultimately to bolstering the economy. And finally, give power away. Our instincts are to hold even more tightly to control in times of upheaval, but it backfires. One of the most effective ways to show leadership, if counterintuitive, is to share power with those around you. Doing this requires asking for help, being clear that you can't do it alone. This also provokes innovation while giving people a sense of meaning. Nothing is worse in a crisis than feeling like there's nothing you can do to help. We follow this new kind of leader through upheaval because we have confidence, not in their map, but in their compass. We believe they've chosen the right direction given the current information, and that they will keep updating. Most of all, we trust them, and we want to help them in finding and refinding the path forward.
Okay, I hope you found that useful. A nice summary of some of the issues, and often referencing the coronavirus pandemic as well, some of the leadership issues there. But in government, one of the challenges is for leaders to wrestle with what we call the politics of bureaucratic coordination, because it might be that within government you'd assume that they were all acting in one voice, but government departments often have their own ambitions and goals and objectives. So crises do not always eliminate pre-crisis tensions or pre-existing tensions that might exist between organisations. Even within the one government, you could have different departments with different interests and different politicians that lead them with different personalities and might not always get on. But crises create conditions in which there are pressures for coordination and cooperation. They present risks which may induce political or bureaucratic actors to engage in conflictual and even defensive behaviours. And it can make incompatible bureaucratic norms ever more present, thus exacerbating levels of conflict. Actors may compete forcefully in seeking credit for their contribution to resolving a crisis. So it might be that a rationalistic and tightly coordinated crisis policy making and implementation regime may not always necessarily occur. But at the same time, we know from the literature that conflict isn't always bad. A certain level of conflict in government and within government may be conducive to effective crisis management, because it might be that crisis conflict can stimulate ideas and stimulate creativity. And it might be that too much conflict can lead to stagnation, but a certain degree of constructive conflict and the ability to reflect and scrutinize and perhaps listen to each other can create ways in which future crisis preparedness can be improved. Listening to multiple opinions and understanding what viewpoints are and where they're coming from. One of the things to remember when it comes to an organisation, when it's preparing for a crisis, is this idea of critical junctures. So contingency planning is important, But when we think about critical infrastructures, we're also thinking about the inevitability of failure. If you think about some of Perrow's work, he talks about the idea of complexity and that organizational systems which are complex and interactive, and it could be things like nuclear plants or aircrafts themselves. Small errors in one part of the system can have ripple effects for another. Therefore, crisis preparedness has to take responsibility for that and be aware of that, because in many senses, if we don't actually have a scalable crisis preparedness plan, then it might all fall apart. So we have to understand complexity as part of that. One of the things to reflect on as well is whether a centralised versus bottom-up approach is necessary and required to dealing with a crisis. It's very important that you know whether or not a top-down or bottom-up approach might be desirable or not. Both have their drawbacks and both have their pros as well. But really what this does is reinforce what we've said at the beginning, that crisis preparedness and testing out your plans will give you the best opportunity to think about whether or not a crisis has to be a bottom-up approach or whether there has to be more central level intervention for dealing with it. Often it depends on the scale of crisis. One of the things to think about, even when it comes to your crisis management response, is that sometimes perfect implementation is not always attainable. It's not always attainable to implement everything effectively. And Hogwood and Gunn, all the way back in 1984, wrote about the different things that can get in the way of perfect implementation. And what they argue is, for implementation, perfect implementation to occur, then all of the following conditions need to be met, which in the real world, they argue, are unattainable. So the circumstances external to the implementer do not impose crippling constraints. Does that always happen? Sufficient resources are available at the right time and the right combination. Does that always happen? The policy to be implemented is based on a theory of cause and effect or theory of change, which means that perhaps you've got an evidence-based plan. There are fewer intervening links between cause and effect. We all know that society is complex, so that can be difficult. Dependency relationships are minimal, so there's true coordination. Does that always happen? That there's both understanding and agreement on policy objectives and outcomes by everyone involved in the organisation. Does that always happen? That tasks follow in the best sequence. Again, it goes back to what we said earlier about having a plan and a flexible plan, but we can't always assume that's in place. That there's perfect communication and coordination. And those in authority can demand and obtain perfect compliance. Is that always the case? So these are things to reflect on when you're thinking about crisis management and the different case studies that are involved. And from your perspective, when it comes to the assignment, does your crisis that you've chosen demonstrate perfect implementation? And indeed, is it possible to have that? That's really where your critical analysis comes in and your opportunity to engage with some of these debates. Reputational risk is key when it comes to crisis management. Every crisis will differ in some way. Therefore, your actions as a public servant need to be aligned to the phase that you're dealing with. And there's not always a neat chronology of events. An incident might occur, an incident might escalate and then recede, an incident might be resolved, and then the recovery phase begins. But what's at stake if you get it wrong? Well, your reputation. Cassio in The Merchant of Venice, William Shakespeare said, reputation, reputation, reputation. Oh, I have lost my reputation. I have lost the immortal part of myself, and all that what remains is bestial. Well, what does that tell us? It means that reputation can have an impact on your future career, your sense of self, and your future. So reputational risk for an organisation is very important, because your reputation for being a competent leader is really what you want to have. If you don't have that reputation, then it can ultimately have effects that in the future in terms of your electoral sustainability, whether or not you'll be elected back into office in future, and if you're a longer term career. So some guiding principles when it comes to organisational response. People first. Always put people first. So whatever the crisis is, you always care for the individuals, care for the victims, care for those affected by crisis number one. Second of all, Leadership, senior officials and politicians must be visible and appear to be actively taking control. Everyone has to work to the plan. Plans should be living documents and be flexible and not be fantasy plans. They should be tested, in other words. They should be evidence-based. There should be visible and meaningful action. Decisions will actually make a difference to make sure that stakeholders know about these actions. Communication must start early and keep going. Stakeholders do not like uncertainty, nor do economic markets. Uncertainty is the enemy to the economy. So you need to be clear and consistent with communication from the very beginning, as the video we played earlier shows, that even when you don't have all the information at your disposal, it's still important to communicate and be visible. But number one rule, people first. Always, when you're in an organization, if there's a crisis, you always put people first. You make a point of making sure the victims are looked after, your staff are looked after, and when you're doing communication in the public, and we'll talk more about this next time when we talk about the media, is that you always reference people first in any press statement, any speech you give, any communication. You're always saying that you're sorry to hear about the victims. You will do everything you can to resolve the crisis. And it might not necessarily be victims involved. It might be those affected in the economy, or it could be members of your own organisation. So always people first. I'm not going to play this just now because you can play it in your own time, but this is another talk by Professor Paul Hart, who's also a crisis management expert, who gives workshops to senior executives in government and in private organisations about the possibilities of crises and how it can affect organisations and what it means to lead through crisis. So you've got the link there, and you can watch it in your own time. But just I thought I'd put an extra video in there for you to look at as you see fit. Next time, we'll talk about crisis communication from an organisational perspective as a second part, which we're looking at media engagement. Some suggested reading. Again, you'll have the hard copy slides on the Moodle site, so don't worry about trying to kind of keep on top of this, of all the references in the video. You'll have copies of the slides, so you can look in more detail at these readings. But these are just some readings. I would ask you to read at least maybe 2 or 3 of these resources to embed some of the content and embed some of the discussion we've had on this talk online about crisis and incident management from an organisational perspective. And as I say, we'll come on next time to talk more about the media and crisis response. So thank you. I'll also put some directed reading on the Moodle site, and you'll also have a discussion question to engage with for the session when we meet to discuss this topic. So please do some reading. I hope you enjoyed this session, and I'll see you on the live Zoom at the appropriate time. So thank you very much.